Hello, it's me again, or it is I guess, actually is the proper grammatical structure. I'm here again. I would like to say it's good to see you all again, but I can't see any of you. And I don't want to make presumptions of whether or not it is a good thing or not for you to see me. But I am here with the lecture for week 3. You can almost maybe sigh a sigh of relief that there's only one lecture for this week. And that is because your selection of an artifact for your project is due on February 5th. So if you are on track in this course, this should be the lecture before February 5th, on the Friday, February 5th, when it's due. If you've already selected your artifact, that's fantastic. If you haven't, keep working at it, thinking about it. Again, I'm happy to answer questions with emails in terms of the suitability of artifacts that are chosen, what might fit and what might not, what could work and what couldn't. And obviously, as I defined artifact last week, or at least in the previous lecture, um, almost anything can serve or is an artifact. Depends on how we approach it, what we think of it. And in this sense, again, I'm using the term artifact for this course in a more broader sense than what probably the common definition might be if we went up to people on the street and said, excuse me, what is an artifact? They might come up with things, ruins, things that are in museums or whatever. But I really do mean anything that exists that signifies the past. And we'll be talking more about that as we go along. Now, in the previous lecture on artifacts, I focused on physical objects, whether from archaeological excavations or ruins to everyday items before our eyes, referencing Professor Schrumm's or Dr. Schrumm's work in our department on Mr. Coffee and how very mundane items can tell entire stories behind them. Now, today, I still want to focus on artifacts as things, but we shift the focus a bit to look at documents. Documents meaning text, books, letters, anything written can be seen as a document. And documents are stored in either libraries or archives. And I'll be making that distinction a bit later. But in many ways, what I'm talking about here is a document is a written artifact. But this can be very blurred because a cathedral will have inscriptions, will have tombstones. Now, obviously, if you take a cathedral, you could also have a tombstone as your artifact. You don't have to have the whole cathedral as such. Um, Even coins have inscriptions on them, and anything that is written is, in my view, a text. So often we think of texts only as literary creations, novels, long letters, essays, scholarly works, etc., etc. But a text is anything written with words. Now, we'll talk more about that, and we will see a very important distinction to make with texts if any of you are thinking of dealing with a text as your artifact, um, or if any of the artifacts that you choose as things nevertheless have text on them, writing on them. We will discuss some of those issues and certainly can go by a case by case example too individually if you have a question about it. But I want to deal with the written artifact today. So I've said written artifact or text. What's the difference? And as I'm using it today, there is no difference between a written artifact and a text. Now, a text is a complex thing, and there's very much a concrete part of it, aspect to it, a text, but there also can be non-concrete, non-material aspects to a text. And that's what we want to see today and how to make such distinctions and keep those two things clearly distinct, even as they go together in one thing, but we'll get there, I think, as we go along. So, with that rather rambling introduction, we begin today by then asking the question, what, what is a text? And this is the second slide on the PowerPoint, text and textuality. Um, what is a text? The word text comes from the Latin textus, which means a weave. Textiles, texture, those are words that also derive from the Latin textus that are weaved together, if you think about that. A texture of a fabric, a weave. So how is something written like something that is woven, like a sweater or something? I don't know if we weave sweaters, I'm not into that aspect, but how do those fit together? Well, if you think about it, if you write something, what are you doing? You are arranging letters that symbolize sounds into a certain form, with the parts being something we call words that function when they're together grammatically to convey meaning of some sort. It's not the same as oral language, which too has structure, too conveys meaning, but we cannot study oral language unless it's recorded or written down. What is the relationship between the spoken word and the written word? Something to keep in mind, whether it's written on a piece of paper or on your computer screen or etched in stone. We choose what words to use. Now, our vocabulary, our alphabet, our language gives us a pre-woven material, so to speak, of words and grammar and syntax in order to use within that context what we feel we might want to express, what we're thinking, feeling, desiring to express. And every language has its own structure, has its own type of weave, has its own sign system to signify the sounds we make. Now I go back to lecture, the first or second lecture, when I talked about signification, what signifies something. And signs signify. What I didn't talk about there was supposition, and how a sign functions within a given sentence. What does this sign stand for in what capacity? If I say the sentence, and this is coming right out of medieval logic, Socrates is a man. Is that true or false? Well, it depends on a lot of things. Number one, it depends on what the term Socrates signifies. It depends on what the word is signifies, and it depends on what the word a signifies and what the word man signifies. And we can analyze those individual terms into their component parts and what they signify, what they could signify, and then analyze what are they intended to signify in that sentence. Now, there's a couple of different forms or types of supposition, and I'm not going to bring you into late medieval supposition theory. But in that phrase, Socrates is a man, Socrates, the term Socrates, could signify a male human being. In which case, if there is one, and if there is a male human being named Socrates, then that statement is true. Now, obviously, Socrates no longer lives, the Socrates. So if it's referring to the Socrates, we would have to use the past tense of the copula, is, to say Socrates was a man. But that's called personal supposition. And it works not only for individuals, it can work for any term. In personal supposition, almost what we would normally think of as the sign of a name or a term or a label. But if we say material supposition, that is the intent, then Socrates is a man is false. Because with material supposition, the sign stands for itself. And in that sense, we'd say, no, Socrates is not a man. Socrates is a name. I hope you can get that distinction. You can say, well, of course, but no one's going to get confused if we are talking about Socrates, whether we're talking about an individual or we're talking about a proper name. Well, yes and no, maybe, but we're looking at logical structures and how the language actually functions. And so, in that sense, we need to know what type of supposition is implied, intended, being used to evaluate the truth or falsity of a proposition. Anything, almost, we could think of. I'm not going to belabor that point. That's just something I want you to be aware of and to realize that what we take for granted and what in everyday life doesn't cause all that many problems. I mean, there's always communication problems, whether it is, as you're driving and whether or not people use the right signals and do they actually do what what we think they're going to do, to, asking for help in a store or checking out in a grocery store. There's all kinds of opportunities for miscommunication. And most of those are extremely banal, and we don't even stop to think about them or worry about them. In personal relationships, it's far more problematic. If any of you have been in personal relationships, friendships, or romantic relationships, you probably have experienced, at least once, a problem of communication. When one of you in a relationship misinterprets or misunderstands what the other one is trying to say. Depending on the context, depending on what you bring to what you hear, as opposed to what the other person means and intends to convey. Tone, um, tone, level of voice, tenor, all those aspects contribute to communication. And communication is really a miracle that we can communicate at all. Now, all of a sudden, you're beginning to see, I hope, the weave nature of a text. It is a woven togetherness of signs within a structure with rules and within a context and a frame that gives it some sort of meaning that we try to discern. It's not all that different from art critics trying to interpret the meaning of a painting. I mean, there's that painting over my shoulder here. I have no idea what it is. A colleague and friend of ours painted it. And I'm sure he painted it with some intent and meaning. I think it's just kind of nice visually, like the colors, like the shapes. And I haven't stopped to think too much about what it means or what it's trying to represent. But we could sit and say, okay, well, what is that? I wonder. And you might have a very different interpretation than I do. You might see things in it differently than I see them, or you might see things that I don't see, or vice versa, all which would affect our interpretation of that thing that is communicating something. Now, language is no different than a painting. A painting is a weave of ideas, imaginations, symbolic representations to say something about something, even if it is simply beautiful, even if it's simply fun shapes. That too could be what this is, simply color and shape, or it could be, there's a medieval phrase saying that has then continued throughout the centuries. We, in our age and day and age, are simply like dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, look at that. We have a smaller rock on top of a larger rock. So, it could be maybe that's what it's getting at. That the process of living is simply being dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. Yet they're both kind of falling down and back and sideways. So it's just the instability of any given moment. You say, well, you're over interpreting. It's simply shapes. Could be. But the same problems exist with text. To the point that, yeah, the example I already used, I believe, in that lecture dealing with signification is the meaning of the word is, and how the disagreement over what the word is meant in the context of the words of institution. This is my body in the 16th century led to war. They have problems, and that communication and the lack of being able to communicate effectively or disagreement about communication um, can have serious consequences. But the thing is, whatever our interpretation of that painting is, it remains what it is independently from our view of it, from our perception of it, from our interpretation of it, from what we think it actually might mean. And then we have to say, okay, well, part of this is, too, is what is it doing in this room where I'm videoing my lectures? How did it get there? Why is it hanging on the wall? Why isn't there a frame around it? Why is it sitting, leaning up against the wall on what looks like a dresser? Obviously not very important to me, or maybe it really is. Maybe that was part of the whole display. Maybe the meaning is not just the painting, but the painting in context, against the wall, on top of the dresser, leaning up. There's all kinds of different considerations to take into account if we're going to say, what is this painting and what does it mean? The same for every text we encounter. Again, I think I said in the lecture on signification, we could analyze every individual sign in every individual word, because every word we have is a sign or a weave of signs, whether it is a single letter like the article a or a pronoun I. What do those signify? It's a problem. And then when we put these letters or these signs together to form a new thing, what does that new sign signify? Now, I'm not trying to freak anybody out. And again, I'm not trying to say we're back to the level of philosophy and meaning and being and reality, but we need to realize the complexity of written language when we go to interpret it, as well as when we go to write it. And that structures are given us that we should not simply assume everybody understands. We should need to be aware consciously of those structures and frames, the grammar, the language, the alphabet, the shape of the signs, the context, the setting, all these different aspects. If we are truly interested in understanding, discerning in some fashion the meaning. Now, I have up here too the world of the text. The world of the text is all of these things. There's text and context, you might want to say, okay, but what constitutes context? And can we know a context except by means of other texts? But we'll get to that problem shortly. That's the paradox of context. But just to look more specifically at this, the world of the text, as I'm talking about, and this comes from the philosophical field of hermeneutics and Paul Ricoeur and Gadamer, whom I mentioned, I believe. We can talk about three different types of text for the same thing that we're looking at. We can talk about the pretext. If we have a document, a written, let's say a letter, okay, just a letter. The pretext is not what we would say in the comments, a pretext for something else, okay? We use it in those ways. That's not really what you're meaning. It's just a pretext for something else. But that gets at somewhat what I'm meaning here in a more specific analytical sense. The pretext is everything that goes into making that text possible. What was necessary for that text to actually be there? And if it's a letter, is it a handwritten letter in a certain kind of ink? To whom is it addressed? Is it dated, or do we have to try to figure out when it might have been written? Do we know the person to whom it is addressed, or is it an open letter addressed to anybody who might come across it? In a literary genre, that is certainly often the case where people write letters to, posterity. Petrarch wrote letters to posterity. Um, or is it a personal letter that was meant to be private? Or is it a letter to the editor of a newspaper, which is intended to make a point about something that was read in the paper? So a response from the reader. So it's almost a response to something else. And so, what also is it responding to? Because that is needed to understand what is going on in this text. If the letter is something that, let's say, I wrote in my own hand, if you can read it, I say, "Dear John, it was so great seeing you last year at the conference. I'm not sure if I want to make it this year. I certainly hope so. It'd be great to catch up and go out again and spend as much time possible, talking and drinking rather than going to sessions. That was the most valuable part of the conference I felt last time, as long as you were around there to talk and drink with. So let me know if you're going. I'm not sure, but if you are going, I may try to see if I can swing it this year too. Hope to hear from you soon, Eric." Now, what's necessary to make sense of that? Conference. What conference? There are tons of academic conferences. So if we didn't know these things, we have to say, okay, it's a conference last year. We need to find then, if we know this was written by me, this letter, um, what conference or conferences did I go to last year? When were they? When, approximately this time of year, if I'm thinking it's going to be not just a year ago, it's going to be maybe 7 months ago or something like that. Can we determine what conference it might have been? Now, obviously, let's see, well, Professor Sack does medieval, early modern history. It could be anything. He's not going to be going to the, um, you know, AMA, the American Medical Association conference. He's not going to be going to a conference for sociologists. Um, it may just be a medieval or a early modern or some kind of combination conference. And how many of those are there? And then it becomes very difficult to identify to what I am referring, because then we have to decide, who is this John that I'm writing to? And if all we had was the letter, I have to go through all my contacts, and certainly if this was on email, it'd be easier to find because it would be an email with the email address. But if we didn't have that, this was a written letter, all my different contacts, how many in there that seem to be people I might enjoy being with are named John. Um, find out who they are, and of those, who might be likely to attend similar types of conferences as I might. And, so even just figuring out what this letter is dealing with and what had gone on that makes this letter understandable at all could necessitate a lot of research and investigation. And there's to say, okay, what society, what organization is having this conference? Why was it having this conference? Um, and all these things that go together to make possible that I would write such a letter. That's all part of the pretext for that letter. The same with any book. What made this book possible? It's not just a creative genius coming out of someone's head. I don't know how many of you have read, I'm trying to think of it, a nice book. Okay, I'll just use a historical example. Virgil's Aeneid. It's a book, it's a poem, a long, extensive poem. Everybody should read Virgil's Aeneid. What made that possible? It wasn't simply Virgil's genius, it was also the fact that Augustus had commissioned him to write a new history of Rome, and his Aeneid came up with that. And the more and more we go, we see that there's a whole world behind every text, from a personal letter to a masterpiece work of world literature. There is a pretext, not in the sense of um, a guise for something else, but everything that made the text as we have it today, the object, possible to be there. And it's a whole realm of work, research and work, but it all is part of that text. Then there's the paralocutionary text. By paralocutionary text, what I mean by that, this is not my term, but from literary theory, is what is being said, not within the text that's being written or spoken, but simply by the speaking or writing thereof. So, okay, what is the paralocutionary text of this lecture right now? It's not just the words I'm saying, the information I'm trying to communicate, the ideas that I'm hoping to communicate, trying to explode your mind or open your mind to seeing things in an infinitely more complex way. It's also part of the fact that this is a lecture in a course at IUPUI. And by giving it, I am demonstrating my concern to share with you my knowledge and my understanding as part of my being assigned to have taught this course, which I enjoy teaching very much. So it's not like, oh, I don't want to do this. I love doing this, but it is the whole aspect that I'm actually giving this lecture. Now, in a classroom setting, I walk in there, but this is a video. Why am I doing it on video? You could say, because you are lazy. It'd be much more effective if you simply wrote out your lecture and we could read it and not have to worry about it, or maybe do both. But let me see. In case you haven't realized this yet, I'm not simply reading a written out lecture to you. I would have to go back and transcribe this entire lecture, write it down in some fashion, or somehow find it in written form, and then post that as well, so you could have both the text and the video of me reading the text. But actually, I think that is a ridiculous way to learn. You know, if I were giving an academic paper, which I do at conferences, like the one with John, actually it's a couple of years ago now, but that's another whole long story. I basically read the text, even though I do also present more extemporaneously. And that is a different function and a different means of communication than my communicating to you or attempting to communicate to you on video. As a part of this paralocutionary text of this lecture, you could say, well, it was just simply my laziness. Or it is my decision that I think videoing my lecture would be more effective, giving it in this form more extemporaneously. Obviously, I can't say I know what I'm going to say in moment to moment. That's not the case, whatever. But I have the structure on the PowerPoint, so I put that up there. But I'm not sure what's going to come out of my mouth. You say, that's pretty obvious, Professor Sack. But rather than giving this staid, formal address, I think the spontaneity, trying to recapture something of a classroom experience, even though there's still no interaction. But when I'm in a classroom, I don't bring in my text and put it up there and say, okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. I'm going to read you the lecture for today. End of page 1. It's not how I do it. Because I'm not trying to communicate to you information. I say, then I don't have to worry about it. No, there is information contained in my lecture. But what I'm trying to communicate to you, to affect, is to, again, open your mind, to make you try to think about things, to maybe try to get you to see things in a way that you haven't looked at things before. And that can't be done simply by, here is information piece 1, here is information piece 2. I hope you all are taking notes, but it's not an issue of text. A text is blah, blah, blah. How many of you have seen Dead Poets Society? No. If you haven't, you should. Robin Williams. But it's great because, you know, this East Coast boarding school of rich kids, and and Robin Williams is the English teacher. And he's teaching poetry, and first day he walks in, and the boys were nervous and everything else with the new teacher. He has them open up the textbook, which had been used for years and years and years, and has one of the students read the first page, and it's very horrible. Talking about, quantifying the worth of a poem. And he diagrams it on the board, what the author is saying, how we analyze poetry. And when it gets through, he said, okay, now rip out that page, because that's not poetry. In some ways, that's what I'm trying to do here. Whether I am successful or not is another issue. But that is part of the perlocutionary text. Even though, well, I just talked about it, but even though it's not the majority of what I'm saying, if that makes sense. So it's this thing of, I can say, fire in various different contexts. Talk about, misleading speech and the whole issue of being in a crowded theater, which we haven't had for over a year now, I hope to God, because of COVID-19. When someone stands up and yells, fire! The text itself is pretty simple. Fire. We know what that sign means, that word, that weave of individual signs. We know what it signifies. And within a context of a movie theater, someone standing up and yelling, all that is part of the perlocutionary act, or the perlocutionary text. Because it's in that context that text, fire, is very different from, wouldn't it be nice to have a fire? Now, even that, what do we mean by that? Well, that sentence, wouldn't it be nice to have a fire? If I'm sitting home with my wife, and if we had a fireplace, which we don't, and it's kind of chilly, and if I say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a fire? We all know what that means. We all know what that fire means. But let's say I'm kind of a wacko, and I'm a pyromaniac, and it's like, wouldn't it be really nice to have a fire? It means something very different. What I am saying through saying what I'm saying is central for understanding the meaning of what it is that I'm saying. That's the perlocutionary text. And then up there, I have the textual horizon. Now that you've thoroughly absorbed the pretext and the perlocutionary text, and how that affects the meaning of any text that we come across, then there's the textual horizon. Textual horizon refers to the expectations that the creator of the text has for readers or receivers of that text. You can say, isn't it the same as the perlocutionary act? If I, from this lecture again, if my intent, to come back to the issue of intent, is to open your minds and things, isn't it the same as my expectations? Not really, because I expect that you will read this. I hope that you'll listen to this. I hope that you will take notes. I hope that you will stop and think about things. Now, if I had different expectations, I might choose a different form of delivery. Virgil wrote the Aeneid for Caesar Augustus, but at least in one interpretation of it, one that I hold and follow, he's also being rather critical of Augustus, or at least giving Augustus a warning. I could go into all that, but that would take us too far afield. He knows he's writing something that people will be reading. He knows it's going to get out there. So he's writing for a particular purpose. If I were writing a book on Augustinianism in the later Middle Ages for a general audience, it's going to be very different than the book actually that I'm working on right now, which is for people who are specialists in the general field of later Middle Ages, late medieval intellectual history, philosophy, theology, religion. So the horizon, what I'm looking towards, what I'm hoping to contribute to, affects what it is I actually write. Do I translate the Latin of titles? Do I translate the Latin of passages I'm quoting? Well, it depends on that textual horizon. For what audience am I writing for? Can I expect that they would know Latin? Those are the types of issues that are involved. Now, the reason I say these things is in this world of the text, which is then, to sum up the world of the text, is everything that made the text possible, the existence of the text possible, is one thing. Then there is the very act of the production of the text, the perlocutionary text, and then there are the expectations of whomever it is that is producing the text for what it's all about, which conditions how the text is being produced, as well as the text itself. All of that together forms the world of the text. And from a single text, just like from a single painting, if we can dissect it all and figure it out and do all the research, if we can reconstruct that world of the text, wow, wow, that'd be quite something. What that text, that object, that artifact potentially can reveal, it's mind blowing. We are walking into the past as we seek to reconstruct, to the extent that we can, the world of the text that we're reading. Now, textuality. Text and textuality. Textuality is just the study of texts and their contexts and how they fit together. It's a real problem. It focuses on primarily the text itself, the actual words of the text itself. And here we talk about three other components of the text, which are somewhat related to the world of the text, certainly contribute to the world of the text, but are more internal to the text itself. So if we think of a text as being a thing here like my fist, and the world of the text is all of this, now we're moving to the text itself, my fist. Now there we have the subtext. Now, the subtext is related to all of those above. The subtext, we know it, that's just a subtext word. It's a little bit different from a pretext. But in the common usage of the term pretext as a guise for, the subtext is getting toward that understanding. It is what is underneath the text. What is the text hiding in terms of meaning and intent and all those things, by being what it is, whereas the real intent is something underneath. So here it's very much part of the perlocutionary text. The perlocutionary text and the pretext are very much part to form the subtext of a text, what lies underneath it, even though they're greater than that, because not all of the pretext is part of the subtext. Why do I choose the word that I use? Why do I write in this particular style? And sometimes you can say, well, that's the only way I know how to write, and my vocabulary is limited. Well, that could be. But within that world of my skills, facility with language, my vocabulary, why am I choosing a particular word? Is it simply inspiration, or do I have a meaning? Am I trying to make a point, depending on what that I'm writing? Am I trying to phrase something in a different way that could be more biting, depending on what type of a text I'm writing? If I'm writing a critical piece, if I'm writing a book review, which I do, we scholars, we write and critique each other's works. Unless I think this work is really the book I'm reading is really a piece of crap, and I've read too many of those. And I really think it's a piece of crap. I can't, in my review, simply say this is a piece of crap. So I couch it in other ways. Now, It also could be is it written by somebody I know and either like or don't like? Because I would phrase things in different ways. I might still have the same evaluation, but instead of saying things like, unfortunately, the author wasn't able to take into consideration the following factors, which may have um, led to her revising the conclusions that she came to, even though based on what she did look at, um, the conclusions she makes her case, even though it's based on a limited source space or something like that. Instead of saying the author obviously didn't know the most important sources in the field or the scholarship in the field and has no idea what it is that she's doing. Otherwise, she would have realized that she did not discuss X, Y, and Z, and based on this, ignorance led her to completely miss what it's all about, and her conclusions then are faulty. In essence, those kind of two statements are saying the same thing, but in different ways based on different pretexts or subtexts. Okay, because the subtext under there is I want to ream you up the what. I want to embarrass you publicly, or gosh darn it, I really want to try to support you and help you. And there's all kinds of issues because if I'm running a review of a younger scholar, I might not be as critical as an opponent, older scholar who don't think they know what they talk about. All those different types of aspects are all part of the subtext, and it's there in every text, whether it's a book review, a commentary, a political argument, whether it is a novel. There is a subtext there. Now, the intertext is what is within the text itself. Perhaps the best way to illustrate this, and I'll break it apart most clear way, is with medieval compilation. Excuse me, that didn't come out very well. Medieval compilations. These are works, usually historical works, chronological works, histories of big things, and they what we would today call plagiarism. They just plagiarize from all over the place, cut and paste things, put it into their work. So most of their text is not the work of the author, but we call them the compiler. Now, sometimes they give indications of where they're getting their work, sometimes not. So how to analyze those things? And then the question is the meaning of this piece of text, let's say in this case, Augustine, that was written by Augustine, but then one of the World Chronicle of Helena Formal, late 12th, early 13th century Cistercian, wrote this massive World Chronicle. I did a lot of work on for a while, editing some parts of his work. When he takes from Augustine, picks it up and puts it into his work, he didn't write those, he didn't compose those words, did not compose those words. But do they have the same meaning as they were in Augustine's work? Now, sometimes he just assumed that his reader, from the horizon, would know what he's referring to, making allusions without even realizing. We all make allusions very frequently and expect our reader to know what we're talking about, because if they don't, they'll be clueless. What? What is this about? One of my favorite poets, I think I've already mentioned, is T.S. Eliot. I love his poetry, but his poem, The Wasteland, is to me, for the most part, incomprehensible. Why? Because I don't understand his allusions. He even had to include footnotes explaining a lot of them. And even doing that, I just don't have the patience to do that. But even if I did, I might not really understand what he's getting at because I don't understand the allusions and the references that he's not making explicit. Just tell me what you think. Whereas most all his other poetry, I think, is fantastic, even though it's still symbolic and all those other things. Sometimes kind of, what are you getting at? Yeah. But The Wasteland is like, what? I don't know if you've ever tried to reading The Wasteland. Modern literature, James Joyce is very much similar along those lines. How do we really get at what's going on? What's he referring to? What are the and all these things that are being referred to, explicitly or not, but especially not, is part of what we call the intertext. The intertext, that which is assumed in the writing of the text itself. So if I'm assuming, even if I'm not taking words from it, I don't have to take words. It's just what as I'm writing, I'm thinking and saying, okay, my readers, at least the ones I care about, will know what I'm talking about because they've read it too. And they'll see that in my text, if that makes any sense. So there's a whole field. It was very popular 10 years ago. It's kind of died down. 10, 20, 30 years ago, it's kind of died down. Now it's called intertextuality and intertextual references and things. But if we think of it as just the what is assumed, the knowledge that a composer or creator of a text assumes her or his readership has, that he can then write based on those assumptions that are coming in. For example, if I wrote um, an article for a newspaper or a letter to an editor, dear editor, I say, January 6th was even more dangerous than 9/11. All of you would know what I was talking about. You might agree or disagree, but you would know what I'm talking about. If you were from a foreign country, if you weren't a historian and in 200 years you come across this, January 6th is more damaging. I forgot what I said. Dangerous than 9/11. You would have to reconstruct what am I meaning? That's part of the intertext. All of those things that I assume my reader just knows and the references they'll understand. Whether it is other particular texts, whether I'm quoting it or referring to it, making reference to it, echoing it, paraphrasing it, or whether I'm quoting it without citing it, or whether I'm simply alluding to it. I'm assuming it. That's part of the intertext. And then post-text. Post-text is the history of the text after the author has constructed it and composed it. So in many ways, it is the reception of the text, the impact and influence of a text, how has it functioned and what difference has it made. Virgil's Aeneid, going back to that example, has had a hugely important post-text. The post-text of Virgil's Aeneid, in some ways, is far more important than the text itself because of the influence and impact that it had, not only on Latin, but on culture, on empire, depending on how you interpret things. It's a hugely important text because of the post-text, that which comes after. In more concrete sense, because influence and impact are very difficult to discern. The printing histories. How did this text get in the form that we are reading it? Whether it is translations, and what does that tell you? If we, say, I want to read, golly gee, let me think of something. Well, I'm listening to Professor Sack talk about Virgil's Aeneid. I think it's really great. I'm going to take that as my artifact. That could work. Fool. Cool. Fool. Let me say. Yeah, maybe that was a Freudian slip there because that would be very difficult to do, but you could do it if you wanted to. I'm not going to say no. I just say be careful because it is so difficult. Not the poem itself necessarily, but doing it for this course. But I'll get more into that shortly. The point, though, is unless you read Latin and read Latin extremely well, you're going to be reading a translation. When was this text first translated? Into what languages? When was the first English translation? What is the translation? When was the translation done that you are reading? How is the author or the translator changing and altering the text? Is it the entire text or is it an abbreviated form? Who is publishing it? Is this a translation intended for scholars? Or is it a translation for high school kids to read? Is it, something that is more general popular? Because Virgil, just think, if I can toss off references to Virgil, I'll sound so educated and so cool and so erudite. So I'm just, there we go. You see what I'm trying to get at? All that is involved in the post text. So if you are trying to go back and analyze Virgil, you have to sift through all the history of post text to get back to the text itself. Otherwise, what you're analyzing is not the text itself, but some aspect of the post text, the impact and influence and the transmission and reception of the text, which is very, very important. But it's not the same as the text itself, depending on what we're asking. Now, we could ask the question, okay, how did people in 19th century England read Virgil? Very good question. That we could look at. But then we're talking about 19th century England. We're not talking about Virgil. If we want to talk about Virgil, we have to try, again, to get back to Virgil to the extent possible. Not the 19th century reception of Virgil, or the 20th century reception of Virgil, or the 21st century reception of Virgil, or the 7th century reception of Virgil, and on we go. When did Virgil start to have the influence that he did? And that is something I deal with constantly with working Augustine or Augustine. That's what I do. And I have frequently argued that what we need to do is try to get back to Augustine. But that's difficult, and that's different from looking at Augustine and how Augustine was understood and interpreted in the 14th century. That's a different Augustine than Augustine, and that's different from our current modern understanding of Augustine. So often just to use this in terms of the post-text. Oh, I keep messing up my own. Sorry. PowerPoint slides. There you go. Sorry. Come on. There you go. Ah, have it back. So often we conflate the two. Because number one, there's Augustine's texts. What are they? How are they preserved? How did they get to the situation they're in for us to actually read them? Do we read the actual manuscripts? Well, we can. We also read critical editions that scholars have put together to say this is the text of Augustine. On what basis do they do that? Augustine's dead and gone. If we're reading a translation, can we really talk about Augustine by means of a translation? He didn't write in English, he wrote in Latin. How do we get back there? And then, so we say, okay, well, let's evaluate the influence of Augustine here in the 14th century here, and we're here. I can't, so it's a triangle in some ways. I can't do a triangle. I can't do a triangle. There's a triangle. Here we are. And what we want to know is Augustine here, his influence in the 14th century here. And we are doing that based on what we think of here. So we say, oh, we know what Augustine is. And what these people thought Augustine was isn't Augustine, because we know what Augustine was. My point is that, but our understanding of Augustine may be different from the 14th century understanding of Augustine, but it's the same thing. We are still receiving and interpreting Augustine, and how can we get there when scholars today who study Augustine himself disagree about some fundamental aspects? What do we do about what's called the pseudo-Augustinian works? There's a number of works that were ascribed to Augustine in the Middle Ages, which modern scholars have shown, no, that's not really Augustine. It was written by somebody else and then became attributed to Augustine. But people in the 14th century, some of them even, thought that it was Augustine. And so if we were trying to understand the 14th century, to say, oh, yes, but they were so stupid, they didn't realize that that wasn't Augustine, that was a pseudo work. So their knowledge wasn't very great. What hubris and disgusting egoism that would be. Now, I can go off on that a long time. My point here is that for every text, we have to be distinguished between the text itself, the post-text of its transmission, reception, impact, influence, the intertexts, and the pretext. Whew. And to do that, as almost a precondition for even beginning to be able to get at the world of the text. Man, oh man, oh man. Difficult. How do we sift through it all? Out there, author's intent. I'll try to keep this quick and easy. Author's intent. Can we ever get to the author's intent? If our point is to say, what did Augustine mean? On what basis can we do that? We have his texts. What if we wrote something that seems inconsistent? Does that mean he made a mistake? Does that mean he changed his mind? How do we know what he was intending to do? What if he wrote several versions, as we know he did, of things? What is his view on the interpretation of Genesis? He wrote 3 commentaries on Genesis in 3 different periods of his life. And there are 2 other works that could very well be seen as interpreted as commentaries on Genesis. So if we have these 5 commentaries on Genesis, what do we say about Augustine's view of Genesis? It gets to be very difficult. Can we really know what's in the author's head? Can we reconstruct what's in the author's head? Because there too is something called the mental text, that which the author has in his or her head, that then gets translated onto the paper, or parchment, or stone, or computer screen. And for us, that is very important to keep in mind too, because as you are writing, that's what you are doing. I cannot grade what's in your head. I can only grade what I can interpret based on the text that you present. We'll come back to those issues, but that's what we're getting in terms of the author's intent. This goes back too to the issue of who am I? I think I talked about that a little bit in the first lecture. I'm like a conglomerate of my own understanding of myself, my family's understanding of me, all of your understanding of me, and it's very difficult to understand of who is Professor Sock. Same thing with author's intent. Is the author's intent the only basis for determining what a given author or something we ascribe the name of an author to thought and felt and believed at a given time and place? That's what scholars do all the time. We debate. No, he didn't really mean think that. He really meant this, and here's the reason why, and here's the reasons why over here, and we go back and forth. Now, at times it can be rather frustrating. There's no easy way through it. But I would say that's only one part of it all. We're not trying to get into the heads of the minds of the individuals in the past who are dead. That is impossible. We cannot get to their minds. We cannot get to their intent. We can only get at their action. We can get at authorial action, the actual construction of the text. But we cannot then make the next jump to, and that was what was in their head, and that's what they thought and believed. I hope that distinction is clear. You could analyze me based on this lecture and my previous lectures. And on one level, you would have a legitimate basis to say, on this basis, I know Professor Sock. Someone else with different bases, my friend John, to whom I wrote about the conference, knows me in a very different context and say, yeah, but your portrayal of Eric is completely faulty. It's based on so little. There's so much more there, or less there, or whatever. That's kind of what I'm getting at. This idea that texts reflect the minds of the authors is a fallacy. We want to think that because we want to think that what we write reflects what we think and feel. And it's frustrating if I write something, and I've had this experience, I learned this in college, actually in a history class, when I didn't do very well at all on exam. I think I got a D minus or something after I'd gotten mostly A's, and I went in to talk to my instructors, why didn't I do well? He said very simply, didn't answer the question. I said, well, yes, I did. He goes, no, you didn't. Yes, I did. He goes, no, you didn't. He goes, well, tell me what you intended to say. And so I talked him through it. And he said, well, that's pretty good, but that's not what's here. And he showed me, and we went through. I thought, oh, okay. When we are writing our drafts, whether it's of my draft of my book or the draft of your project, often, I'm not saying all, often, what I do in any case is I write so that what I write signifies to me what I think is in my head. So as I'm typing and reading what I'm writing, here's our paper and writing it out. Okay. Oh yeah, that's what's in here. I'm trying to get what's in here onto here. And as long as I can read here what I think is in here, yeah, that signifies to me what is in here. But what I write on that basis is one loop might not communicate at all that to a reader. So we have to be aware of this loop, the author to the writing, as well as the text to the reader. And if the author is too caught up here, that's not going to get at what was in the author's mind in the text, or if it's only looking at this. That's where that world of the text is, where the horizon of the text comes in, and everything else. That's the difficulty. So if we're analyzing the text, we need to be aware of what it is that we're analyzing and what meaning we can derive from it and what we can say about it, because that's the whole point and purpose of using texts as artifacts. Now, this has spent a lot of time on this, but it's important. So I'm going to go briefly through the rest because it's hopefully not as important, even though it's still important. Libraries. Documents often are contained and preserved in library or in archives, and books are contained in libraries. There's a difference between archives and libraries. And library, since the title itself says a biblioteca or libraria or whatever, whether it's the Romance language root or a Latin root, are for books. Archives are for documents, wills, testaments, letters sometimes, records, receipts, all those types of documents that are written but aren't like a book form. Now, there are private, public, and state libraries. They all kind of contain different things. So, I mean, this is more important for medieval manuscripts and things than it is for today. I'm not even going to deal with the internet stuff. But knowing where something is preserved and housed is important in terms of access and everything else, and how did it get there, because that's what one of the things we have to do is how did it get there. Today we think everything is available. All we have to do is go on the internet and boom, there it is. That poses its own problems. I would really discourage, I'm not going to say absolutely no, I'd really discourage anybody from selecting or choosing a text on the web as an artifact. You could, but then we'll really have to talk about how to deal with it. Okay? I'm not saying you can't use like images or paintings. I'm not saying you can't use the web or the internet or whatever it is for this project. I'm not saying that at all. You can, depending on what you select. In some ways, you probably will need to, whatever it is, to find things out, especially since with COVID, we're somewhat limited. But the repository of where something is preserved is important for understanding the post text of whatever it is. Now, archives, and there's public, private, and state archives too. In Indianapolis, we have the Indiana State Library, we have the Indiana State Archives. Both here, both important. The only problem is that sometimes archives do have books and sometimes libraries do have documents. So that's more an issue for library science than it would pertain to our project, I think. But I want you to be aware of that distinction as we go through. But then and I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. Regardless of whether it's a document in an archive or a book in a library, anything that we have and that it has written, as I try to say, as a text, is an artifact. So we need to look at documents and books and anything written as a thing. I have up here documents as things. Focus on the object. Every document is a thing. Before you say text, don't go immediately to what the text means, the ideology, the ideas there or whatever. Look at it as a thing. And this is, I would say, it's true whether it is on the internet as a thing, or whether it's in a library that you pick up, or whether you buy it on Amazon.com, or anything else. Look at it as an object. Texts are transmitted as objects in various forms. What is that object? That's going to tell us a lot about the post text. It could tell us about the textual horizon. Now, traditionally, the internet's changed a lot of things. When we look at documents as things, especially with books, we're talking about a subdiscipline called codicology, the study of books, of the codex in Latin, the actual physical thing. Again, this is more for medievalists, early modernists, but is important too in terms of more recent books, to know who's publishing, where they're publishing, what quality of publication is it. That all is important too, again, for the post text. We're trying to understand what does this object have to reveal about when it was written or whatever else. Okay? And that's trying to get at the meaning. So when we move from the text document as an artifact to the text itself, we have more of a problem. Paleography. That is the study of handwriting, the study of script. You could also then add the study of printing, printing press, and printing traditions. Later on, I don't expect any of you um, to choose a medieval work or an early printed work. You can say, well, are you just bringing this lecture in from somewhere else? It's like, well, I've talked about this stuff a lot. It more is an indication of when I think of texts and documents where my mind goes to. And I don't want to take a lot of time to make the connections between medieval, early modern texts and documents and contemporary texts and documents. I'd rather do that on an individual basis. If I want to bring this up for you so you can at least get some sense of understanding what goes behind. Paleography, the study of handwriting. That can be very difficult. Translating is part of that too. Then the translation, if you're reading something in translation, who translates it? I already mentioned that in terms of the post text is being so important. What different languages is it being translated into? What's the audience and the popularity of it? And then if we have a piece of written text that weave, what type is it? Is it a novel? That's what we have forms and genres, because that is part of then the subtext, the pretext, not necessarily the intertext yet, but it's part of that world of the text, because I would also then choose a genre to write in. Prose, poetry, novel, short story, whatever. I might be able to have a single point. My point, life sucks and then you die. Okay, let's say that's my view of life, and life sucks and then you die. Ha, ha, ha. Am I going to write a poem about that? Am I going to write a novel illustrating that? Am I going to write a philosophical piece about that? What genre I choose is important. So what is it? Maybe it's just an inscription on a building. Maybe it's graffiti. All these different means of things that communicate text and that preserve text are different forms and genres, and that affects how we understand the meaning of it. Because that's what we're trying to get at, the meaning. Whether it is a book, a poem, a ruin from the 18th century that has just been, dug up by archaeologists at the bottom of the sea, the ancient bones, whether it is something that we just find in our kitchen. What does this mean? And what does this tell us? What does this have to reveal? Because if we don't try to get at the world of the text, the world of the document, because I could say the same thing about the things, the world of the artifact, we're going to be limited in our view. We won't understand the past as much as we could. We're not listening well enough to what these artifacts have to tell us. Just like trying to come up with the meaning of the painting behind me. It's a puzzle, it's an investigation. What does it mean? How did it get there? What does it tell us? And that is what I mean. We talk about doing history. It is getting that world that we do not live in anymore, but is present to us in the present by means of artifacts. Problem is, how do we then start to try to reconstruct that world that no longer exists? Now, I hope this has helped with understanding the artifact you have chosen, or maybe will help you thinking about what artifact you might choose to do your project on. If you have questions about it, of what might work, what couldn't work, email me and we can talk about it. Chat about it. The point is not to choose something that will be easy to do. Because as I've tried to explain or to reveal or to show you, or the pretext or the subtext of what I'm trying to do, not the pretext, the subtext is it's damn difficult. Whatever you choose, whatever artifact you choose, this project is difficult to get at the meaning. So, that being said, good luck. It's also a very, very exciting, or can be. I'll be looking forward to reading all your artifacts and selections of artifacts and why you chose them, and we'll go from there. And I'll be back. Thanks so much. Bye bye.